All right. How's it going? So today, my family, we're kind of in this unique situation because we typically don't do sports where you have sports on Sundays, like so we can all be together and worship. But Mary and Christina are in a karate tournament today. And so I was trying to give them some encouragement. All they could talk about yesterday was winning a trophy, winning a trophy, winning a trophy, winning a trophy. And I said, well, let me give you some insight. You've never been to a karate tournament before, right? They're like, no. I said, okay. I said, if you focus on the trophy, you may lose the prize. But if you focus on your form and on sparring, you may win a trophy. So that's deep, Dad. And I said, so talk me through, like what are you going to do? What are you going to do with, like, when you're sparring? Because they do great with their form. It's so cool to watch them do their form. I said, but they never, like, live sparred someone who's not in their own studio before. I said, those kids are going to hit you. And Mary Jane has her chest pad on, so I'll thump her in the stomach. Dad, what are you doing? Well, the kid, you can't say that tomorrow. And I said, so what are you going to do, MJ? She's like, well, I'm going to use my defense, and I'm going to punch. I said, oh, well, I guess that could work. She's like, what would you do, Dad? I said, well, when he punches, I'm going to slide out of the way, loop his arm, flip him over, and hit him with the elbow. That's not karate, Dad. Well, sometimes we think we know something, and we don't know what we're talking about. I mean, it sounds like a good move to me. Loop the arm, hip toss, little elbow drop to the throat. Good to go. Point. I mean, how in the world does the Karate Kid come out with that one, Is that tournament legal? Apparently it was. We get into all these kinds of things, and we think we know something, and then all of a sudden we find out we didn't know what we thought we know, and what we find out we know is even better than we could have imagined knowing. You ever been in that kind of space? What you thought you knew, you found out you didn't know, but what you didn't know that you thought you knew is even better than you thought you knew. That's Jesus. We think we know Jesus. We have some thoughts about Jesus. And then we find out we don't know Jesus as well as we thought we knew Jesus. And as we discover him more, we find out he's even better than advertised. Better than we could imagine. We get to a space in the text today. If you're brand new with us, I've been going through the Gospel of Mark since the beginning of January. We are at the halfway point through Mark's Gospel. We're in chapter 8 today. And this is a significant move in the Gospel of Mark. Because we've said from the beginning, Mark verse 1, chapter 1, says, this is the story, the beginning of good news of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. And very distinctly, there are two moves that happen where one person confesses Jesus as the Christ, the other will confess him as the Son of God, and that culminates the fullness of what Mark wants to communicate to us. And we get into a space today where we finally can confess that Jesus is the Christ. And it's powerful. And it happens in a place that we really don't expect it to happen. We are in an area called the Decapolis when this happens. Jesus has gone there. He spent some time there. It is a non-Jewish region. So for those of you who are Minnesotan, if you're online and you're not Minnesotan, just work with me for just a minute, okay? But if you're Minnesotan, let's take a trip to the North Shore, okay? And we're going to go from the Twin Cities up to the North Shore. Now, I met someone this morning who's from Duluth. If you're from Duluth, right, you're from the better side right now. Because the Decapolis is going to be on the Wisconsin side, right? And now we have some friends who have, they have their cabins on the Wisconsin side. We're like, oh, good luck. But the Decapolis is like the Wisconsin side. It's not the Minnesota side. The Minnesota side, you're going up the North Shore, you see all the beautiful waterfalls and all these kinds of things. On the Wisconsin side, good luck. That's the Decapolis. It's on the Wisconsin side. And I want to give you that picture because I want you to put it in your brain, the region. What Jesus and his disciples would do is they would go down to Jerusalem, festivals, the Jewish calendar. They would honor that whole Jewish calendar. Jesus lived in Capernaum, which is at the top of the Sea of Galilee. They would travel down to Jerusalem, and they would come back. Sometimes Jesus would go to the western side through Samaria, and we have those stories. Most Jews would try to avoid Samaria, which kind of pushed them to the Decapolis, but that's full of Gentiles. And they're like, we got to deal with Gentiles too. Let's just speed up the wagon a little bit, you know? Jesus decides to stay there for a while. And while he's there, this is where we find Mark chapter 8. In the southeast region of the Sea of Galilee, in those days, there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. Now pause there. Remember, I said, like if you ever watch a Netflix show, like if you ever binge watch a show on Netflix, to truly binge watch means that you've watched it all in one day. But when you get to like season 2 or season 3, they may show a recap at the beginning of that episode that takes you all the way back to season 1, and you're like, oh, I almost forgot that happened if it wasn't for the recap. So there's a few things you should see here in that first sentence. One, Jesus has been in front of large crowds before, right? So he was once again in front of a large crowd. The last time we saw Jesus in front of a large crowd, it was a predominantly Jewish crowd, and they had nothing to eat, and Jesus fed the 5,000. Well, we're called back to that scene. Mark 8 will do this a lot to us today. In those days, there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. That statement should immediately send you back to the feeding of the 5,000. He called the disciples and said to them, I have compassion for this crowd because they've already stayed with me 3 days, and now they have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, and some of them have come a long distance. Now, if you're the disciples, you should know that Jesus can work miracles with bread and fish. You've already seen it once. However, 2 other times in Mark's gospel, it says the disciples did not understand the lesson of the loaves. What do you think is going to happen here? They're not going to understand the lesson because they answer him, where can anyone get enough bread in this desolate place? How many loaves do you have? This sounds identical to what we've already seen Jesus do. Different location, same song, different station, right? Different location, different crowd. Jesus is asking the same questions. This time they have 7. 7 loaves. They didn't have 7 last time. He commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, he broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. So they served them to the crowd. There was also a few small fish, and after he blessed them, he said these were to be served as well. Everyone ate and was satisfied. Same statement from before. They collected 7 large baskets of leftover pieces. About 4,000 were there. He dismissed them. Immediately they got into a boat with his disciples, and they went to the district of Dalmanutha. Now pause real quick. Last time we saw this scene, Jesus collected 12 baskets at the end. He fed an exclusively Jewish crowd. That 12 baskets represents that Jesus is the full satisfaction for all 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Jesus collects 7 baskets of food after feeding non-Jewish people. The number 7 is supposed to tell us that Jesus is the perfect fulfillment for all people in all places in all times. Everything is fulfilled in him for everybody. The numbers matter when you see it. They're telling us a story that if we were in the ancient world reading it for the first time, we would all understand it. We go, oh, that makes sense. We may go 12 and 7. What's the big deal? But that's the big deal. Jesus is, for the entire world, the perfect satisfaction for all people in all places in all times. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, demanding a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation demand a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. Then he got back to them back in the boat, and he went to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to take bread, and only one loaf with them was in the boat. Then he gave them strict orders. Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. They were discussing among themselves that they didn't have any bread. Aware of this, he said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Don't you understand, or have you hardened your hearts? Do you have eyes and not see, and ears and not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets were left over? 12, they told him. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls did you collect? 7, they said. And he looked at them and said, don't you understand yet? Nobody answered. They came to Bethesda. They brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, brought him out of the village, spitting on his eyes and laying hands on him. He asked him, do you see anything? He looked up. He says, I see people. They look like trees walking. Again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes. The man looked intently with his eyesight restored and said he saw everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him home and said, don't even go back to the village. Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they answered, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. Hold that thought. It's the exact same words that we see from chapter 6, verse 7. It's a repeat because in chapter 6, verse 7, it's the people who are actually saying it. So at least the disciples are listening to somebody, right? If they can't see Jesus in the miracle, they're at least hearing on the streets what people are saying. And so then Jesus says to them, but you, who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you are the Messiah. And Jesus gave strict answers to tell no one about him. Then he began to teach that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, be killed, and rise after 3 days. He spoke openly about this. Peter took him aside and began to correct him. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns. Calling the crowd with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? What can anyone give in exchange for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. And he said to them, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come in power. The word of the Lord. When we get into that scene there in the Decapolis, and we watch the miracles, and we see the demand of the sign by the Pharisees, and the 12 who have watched Jesus for almost 3 years now. That's kind of where we are in the timeline, about 3 years into Jesus' life with the disciples. And they get to this space, and he says to them, do you have eyes to see but fail to see, and ears that fail to hear? It's a challenge of understanding. Can you not see who I am? You've been with me for 3 years. Everything I've done in front of you. Everything I've said, I've explained to you. And are you still missing it? Over and over, we see the crowds respond to Jesus better than we see the disciples respond. And we see the disciples respond better than the Pharisees respond, the religious leaders. And it's this exercise in missing Jesus. And it happens all the time. There were signs. The signs were there, but they still didn't see. we get into so many situations in our lives, and we don't want to pay attention to what really is happening in the world. I watch, and I love the scientific world. Like, if you ever sit with me in a situation, you may hear me talk about sometimes you have to think like a scientist. You know, we want to ask why questions all the time, and when we ask why questions, it always brings in emotion with it, especially like when you're dealing with like couples or parents and kids, whatever, and you ask, well, why did this happen? And the emotion comes, and there's immediately accusation comes with why, division comes with why, all my emotion comes with why. Like, sometimes you got to think like a scientist. How could this be? When did this happen? Which would be better? You start asking scientists questions, and it starts to change how you think about your relationship, lets you bring the emotion down a bit. Well, science does some incredible stuff. All the discoveries that are happening, but when you get into the world, like in particular in the world of like theoretical physics, and you start watching all these superconductor experiments, and if we can just create the God particle, then we can prove that creation, as the Bible says it, doesn't exist. A large part of our greatest minds on the planet are coming together not for discovery, but for indiscovery. They want to do all this research and put all this effort to prove that God doesn't exist. When from the foundations of the earth, he says that the work of his hands declare his majesty. And in a short moment of human history, 33, 35 years, the very Word of God who spoke all creation to existence walked among human flesh. And he did what God did. He healed people, he told the truth, and he loved well. And all the signs were there, and they still didn't see. And that can happen for us too, right? Like, we can look at this stuff. When we look at the Bible, we're like, that was 2,000 years ago. We're in the 21st century. We're 25 years into the 21st century. Has anything changed? Like, where is God in the midst of all of this? And how does God operate in these things? And we can see all the signs that tell us that God's right here, and we still miss it. We're right there. Faith forgets when fear speaks. It's going to happen for the disciples. It happens in our own lives. We can have these beautiful testaments of faith. This is what I believe, this is what I believe, this is what I believe. And then something really tragic happens. And then what happens to faith? Faith often forgets when fear speaks. I mean, for the disciples in the situation they were in, they don't want to be with the Gentiles to begin with. Remember, even though many of them might have been like fishermen, zealots, tax collectors, not the most well thought of people in their own world, they were still Jews. And they thought less of the Gentiles than the Jews thought of them. They were still Jews. We don't want to be in this space. We don't know what's going to happen. Like, do we really need to be here right now? And the tensions begin to flare. And you have to ask the questions, even in our own lives. When things start to go sideways, which voice leads most? Is it my faith or is it my fear? And where do we unfold with that? Every time we see the disciples, and it says that when Jesus challenges them about the situation, and it says they didn't understand the lesson of the loaves. They didn't understand. And he always goes back to the loaves. Even when they're in the storms, and they're in the middle of these storms, and they're fearful for their lives, it always goes back to that first lesson of the loaves. That Jesus provides in all situations for all people. He doesn't provide the same way for all people, but he provides. And we miss that, and the disciples missed that, and every time they got afraid, fear conquered their faith. And we start to watch this happen as it unfolds. Signs alone don't change hardened hearts. What more could the disciples need? The Pharisees were already against Jesus. What if he had given them a different sign? Would they have believed? There was a book that came out on prayer years ago, and it challenged us to pray like Gideon, to really seek the Lord, and to lay out a fleece and challenge the Lord to do this with whatever your fleece is. Then you would know that God really wanted you to do something. So this guy Gideon, he appears in the book of Judges, and God wants him to go free Israel from their captivity and take some soldiers with you. And Gideon's like, that sounds awesome, I don't want to do that. But if you really want me to do it, God, I'm going to put a rug outside of my tent, and I want you to make the rug wet and the ground dry. And if you do that, then I'll do what you say. Well, he wakes up the next morning, and guess what? The rug is wet, the ground is dry. So he said, well, I'm not for sure. How about you make the ground wet but the rug dry? He goes to bed, and guess what happens? God wasn't playing with Gideon. He said, I want you to do this. You are my chosen appointed person. Go do this. And then we're taught to pray like Gideon. Gideon was a coward. Gideon was out there trying to get out of what God wanted for him. And it was a best-selling Christian book. Why do I want to join the coward who doesn't believe God? Apparently, you can make a lot of money by writing books about cowards. I didn't want to be like Gideon. What sign does God have to do in your life to show you that his love for you is real? And if you saw that sign, would it matter? We do these kinds of things to God all the time. Just show me that you're there, God. And interestingly enough, he doesn't balk at our requests. More often than not, he still meets us in those places. When everything that we could possibly need to see has already been done. And yet God still meets us in the middle of our fears, our failures and frustrations, and says, I'm God. And this is what I do, and this is what I'm like. And he continues to invite us to himself. We can experience God's work every day and remain blind to who Jesus truly is. You know, I've never woke up one day and had to turn gravity on. Not one day. Sometimes I want to turn it off. I think that'd be pretty cool. But I've never one day woke up and had to turn gravity on. I've never had to check the batteries on the Sunrise. Not once. Never had to flip my calendar for seasons to change. I was telling our tech team this morning, I said, when you're in the people business, life can be chaotic. And I said, just to be clear, I'm not in the God business. I'm in the people business. Because the God business holds the universe together. The God business redeems people from the brokenness of sin and rescues them into eternity with him. God business does that kind of stuff. I work with people. God has the universe under control. It's not chaotic. I work with people. People are chaotic. And we kind of laughed about it. But how many times do we really see the universe around us? And what I mean, like, is our version of the universe, which is about this big, right? Sometimes just like right here at the end of our noses. And everything seems like it's going sideways. And we can see amazing things happen and yet never recognize the impact and the power of Jesus' love for us. We miss it. And that's what happens with these different people. Jesus doesn't need to prove himself again for us to trust him. Like, if we sat down and we laid out the list of evidences, just evidences, mathematically speaking, I could argue with you all day long about the mathematical significance of prophecies fulfilled just in the person of Jesus. And at the end of the day, we would go, that just sounds impossible. But it happened. We could check all the boxes of the things that Jesus did. And at the end of the day, it still gets down to what happens right here. Will I, not can I trust him, will I trust him? Jesus has already proven himself faithful. Everything that could be done, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down their life for another. And he did that. He proved the greatest love to us. And we can sit there with the Pharisees demanding a sign. We can sit there with the disciples and be not understanding of what Jesus is doing. Don't you understand yet, he says. And it really isn't about what he needs to do to prove himself. The proof is there. The evidences are there. Like the scientific reasoning of Jesus is there. And at the end of the day, we have to ask, will I trust him? Not can I trust him? It's all here. It's an act of the will. The problem isn't God's lack of action. It's our lack of recognition. From the very beginning, God has been moving in the lives of his creation, displaying his love and his care, his truth, his grace, his mercy, always. And it is so much easier for us to look at God and blame him for the condition of our lives rather than to thank him for what he's done and is doing. So much easier. I remember my great-grandmother, I've shared this story before, she was a Londoner during World War I and II. She was in the British equivalent of the Girl Scouts in World War I, and she would go along and take care of wounded GIs who were coming back into London and British soldiers who were there to be in recovery. During World War II, her husband was part of the Air Force, and he was off to war, and she and my grandmother, who was now about her age in World War II, 7 years old, they would run around bomb shelter to bomb shelter, rations to rations, just trying to survive in the middle of the war. She was very active in the Church of England before the war. And after the war, she left the church behind. She could not rationalize the impact of evil in the world caused by people with the goodness of God. And she wondered, where was God when all this happened? And I was like running through bomb shelters with you. When I hear her story, when I was young, I wasn't a believer to say that. But when I hear her story, in the records of my memory, I'm like, he was running through bomb shelters with you. He was opening cans of rations and taking care of you. He was there with you. And he was there with the GIs who were dying on both sides of the lines. We often fail to recognize what God's doing because of evil around us. And sometimes we can't even recognize God for the good things that are happening. We want to give it a different name. Rather than God's grace or mercy, we assign it to something else. Karma, luck, fortune, coincidence. When all the time it's been God displaying his love to you, taking care of you. It's not his lack of action, it's our lack of recognition. And Jesus finally challenges that in this chapter. Who do you say that I am? And you notice what they do. Like they start off, who do people say that I am? They give him the answer. I don't know how long the pause is between Jesus' question and Peter's response. In my imagination, and sometimes imagination takes over, right? In my imagination, it's like an episode of General Hospital. Anybody ever watch General Hospital? When I was a kid, my mom made me watch it because that was her quiet. Somebody. I had to be quiet while she watched TV. That's what I know. Because General Hospital was on. Soap operas are incredible. And if you really want to get good soap operas, you should go start watching Spanish television. Right? Telenovelas, they do it the best, right? And you, who do you say that I am? Dramatic pause. And they all just like pause and look. Like, I have no idea how long the pause is here, but I like to imagine at least 4 soap opera pauses as it flashes between Jesus. Or like if you like anime does, anybody watch anime? Just checking. Yeah, it's kind of anime. Anime does the same thing. You know, they're getting in a fight and they pause. Whoa, 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 and then finally, like the scene's over. You're like, what happened? And one guy's laying down and one guy's won. I think that scene is kind of like this. It's like either a good soap opera or a really good anime if either one actually exists. And Jesus is there and he's like, who do you say that I am? Pause, dramatic pause, wait for it. You're the Messiah. That same question is asked every single moment of your life. Every single moment of your life, in every single situation, Jesus says to us, and you, Jeremy, who do you say that I am? When you're staring down that person who just cut you in the Target checkout line. When your kid breaks your heart, stabs you in the back emotionally, who do you say that I am? When the place that you've worked for 20 years sends you a pink slip and says you're no longer wanted, who do you say that I am? When you go through grief and loss, terrible diagnosis, financial uncertainty, who do you say that I am? When you are winning at everything, who do you say that I am? The same question is asked of us every moment of our lives. And at least in this moment, Peter gets it right. At the center of Mark's gospel, Jesus asks the question that everybody must answer. Who do you say that I am? And here's the trigger, right? A partial truth about Jesus is still a false answer. God doesn't deal in half-truths or white lies. A half-truth, a partial truth about Jesus is still a false answer. When I was a kid taking tests, I loved to take written exams where I could write a paragraph or two. I didn't want just a little bubble thing. I didn't want to have to like draw a line to a word. I didn't want to spell. If you've ever gone through a Bible study, I can't spell for anything, right? But man, if you gave me a written response, I could at least convince you that some of what I said is right. And my teachers would write partial credit. They were so generous. Because if they had said choose A, B, C, or D, I was sunk. Most of my friends hated essay answers. I loved essay answers, longer responses, because I could get something in there that she would or he would go, okay, partial credit. There's no partial credit when it comes to this, though. Like, Jesus is either God or he isn't. There's no in between. It's like in our world today, we use the word kind of for everything. My grandmother, when she was still alive, God rest her soul, that's what you're supposed to say, I think. She would tell you she's just got a touch of pneumonia. You're like, Grandma, no one has just a touch of pneumonia. You got pneumonia. Oh, just a touch. What is a touch of? I just got a touch of COVID. No, you don't. You've got COVID. What do you mean a touch? But my whole life, I grew up with her just having a touch of something. What does that mean? Young people, when they get pregnant, yeah, I'm kind of pregnant. No, you're not. You are not kind of pregnant at all. You are very pregnant. Done. But we love to live in this uncommitted, partial world. I'm kind of a. And we think it like lowers the blow a little bit. I'm kind of. I'm kind of Christian. I'm kind of a hockey fan. That one's true. It probably means I'm not a hockey fan, but I'm trying. I'm trying. We didn't have hockey where I grew up. You go through these things. A partial answer about Jesus is still a false answer. Intellectual knowledge is not enough. Some of the greatest books about Jesus ever written are written by people who have zero faith in him at all. Some of the greatest linguistic books on Hebrew and Greek and trying to understand that language, those guys are fantastic language scholars, linguists, and have zero relationship with the God of the Bible. But they love the language. And maybe one day they'll find Jesus through their studies. Intellectual knowledge is not enough. It's different. Well, I can see how one could say that Jesus... This is not a debate. This is not a subject to be taught. There is too much, like when it comes to who Jesus is, there is too much at stake for you, for me, and the rest of the world. Because if he's not God, to be quite frank, every one of us in this room are wasting our time. We are completely wasting our time if he's not God. Paul says it so beautifully. If Jesus is not God, then we should eat and drink and be merry. For tomorrow we die. If Jesus is not God, there is no future. There is no hope. Eat, drink, be merry. Tomorrow, nothing. But if Jesus is God, that's a game changer. That means there's purpose. That means there's identity. There's expectation. There's grace and love and truth and beauty and goodness and all these things left to be discovered. And it really gets down to who do we say that he is. Sometimes we expect Jesus to fix our problems in a way that's not his plan but ours. We want Jesus to meet us on our terms and stay there. He will meet you on your terms and invite you to him on his. Does that make sense? Every space where you are emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, physically, God can meet you and will meet you in those spaces. But the invitation is to join him on his terms. And God's terms always end up through Jesus. We want a crown without a cross, a kingdom without suffering. This is where Peter is. You can't die. Remember Peter's expectation. He's a good Jew. He wants Jesus to go kick the Romans out of town. The Jews live under the oppression of a Roman government. They have been told their whole lives that Messiah is going to show up. He's going to restore everything back into God's order. And for them, they thought, oh, we get to be a great kingdom again. They didn't go far enough back in the book. Because if they went back to Genesis 2, before sin came into the world, that's the work Messiah came to conquer. To restore us into a right relationship with God. And to get there had to be sacrifice. And they knew this. The book of Leviticus is an incredible book of worship, and it talks about all these different sacrifices that had to be made, and Jesus takes them all. And in laying down his life, once and for all, we're told, again in Paul's writings, that Jesus satisfied judgment. He took on our sin. Took our death, took our punishment, took everything upon him and gave us freedom. Peter didn't like that idea initially. You can't do that. You're the Messiah. I just told you you're the Messiah. Get your sword and get about your business. Jesus had heard those words before. You can do it differently. Goes all the way back to his temptations with Satan in the wilderness. And that's why he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. It was the same words being echoed. You don't have to do it God's way. And Jesus is like, I am God. This is the only way. I am the way. And this is what we're going to do. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world but forfeit their soul? So all this is going on. Jesus has been teaching. Peter's confession happens. The disciples are head nodding, agreeing. He tells them he has to suffer. They hate that idea. Remember, again, we got to meet God on his terms. He comes to us in ours, and he invites us to know him on his. So Jesus, no, this is what the work of the Messiah really is. He unveils the truth to him, And if we were watching a movie, boom, the movie would end right there. And then you wait for a little bit, and you get a mid-credit scene. The end of Mark 8 is like the mid-credit scene, because it's going to transition everything into where Jesus goes next. And in that mid-credit scene, he talks to his disciples about following him. All of this has been leading up to who I am, and who do people say I am, who do you say I am. All of what we've seen for the last 8 chapters is built to this, and now we got this cut scene that's going to take us into the next work, right? Recognizing Jesus as king, that's what they just did, now means completely surrendering to him. If anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself. So often we want to focus on take up your cross and follow, like, oh, it's my cross to bear. You don't bear your cross unless you deny yourself. That's where it starts. We live in a world today that is so much about affirming what you think and what you want to do. It's your truth, it's your way, whatever makes you happy. That's what we want to do. This has been building for generations, and we live in a heightened accelerant of that now. And we never start with the impact of Jesus in our lives has to include self-denial. Like, that's the first step. I recognize who Jesus is. Will I follow him? And to do that, I have to deny myself. Because at the end of the day, it really isn't about me. There are greater things in this world and in this universe that are at stake. And you and I both have an incredible part to play in it. And you and I, who believe, will have an incredible celebration of the whole thing one day. Following Jesus isn't about comfort. It's about commitment. He provides comfort in the worst of situations so that we can live committed to him in this world. They go together. But sometimes we just want Jesus to be comfortable for us. I just want, like we want to try Jesus on like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You know the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Girl shows up at a cabin in the woods and some bears live there. I don't understand that at all, but some bears live there, right? And she walks in and the bears have some oatmeal. I also don't understand that. If you're into oatmeal, cool, I'm not mad at you. But they eat the oatmeal, one's too hot, one's too cold, and one's just right. She eats the oatmeal, she gets a full belly, got a little food coma, she goes to lay down. Papa Bear's bed's too big, Mama Bear's bed is too this, too hard, too soft, too whatever. This one's just right. She gets in the bed. That one's just right. Well, the three bears show up. I don't really know how Goldilocks' story ends because in my imagination they all become friends. But I also know Grimm's fairy tales are called Grimm for a reason, right? It's not about comfort. We want to try Jesus on all the time. Can I just put this size on, that size on? Can I just fit here, can I fit there? It's not about comfort. It's about commitment, right? Denying yourself isn't about giving up certain things. It's about giving up control, and that's the hardest piece. I can give up soda, give up cigarettes, give up bad food, give up this, give up that, give up this, give up that. All day long we can do those things. We got all kinds of 12-step programs in the world that are successful at those things. But to give up control? Go talk to any addict. What's the hardest thing for them to give up? It's control. Same for you. We're control addicts. We are. Every single one of us. We want to control our destinies. We want to command the ship. And Jesus says, follow me. Deny yourself and follow me. It's an issue of the heart, of the soul. The paradox of Christianity, last two slides right here, right? Catch this. This is where it all comes down to. It transitions us to Jesus' mission from here. All comes down to this. The more we hold on to our lives, the more empty we feel. Who will hold on to his life, Jesus says, and forfeit his soul? The more we hold on to our lives, the more empty we feel, because our lives cannot fulfill our souls. Only God who made you can do that. And to live life for anything else besides him will leave us empty every time. Temporarily satisfied, but satisfaction goes away. Ask the Rolling Stones. It happens. The other paradox aside of that is this. The more we surrender to Jesus, the more fully alive we become. I grew up in a world where to follow Jesus. Jesus was the cosmic buzzkill, because if you followed Jesus, you couldn't smoke weed, get drunk, run around with girls, do all. If you follow Jesus, you can't do that. And so many people will say, he's just this cosmic, I can't have a fun life if I say yes to Jesus, and I'd rather have fun. I said yes to Jesus in the midst of all of those kinds of things. In the process of it, I think I discovered the greatest life I could know on this side of heaven. No regrets. I wake up in the morning and I have regrets over what my life looked like before Jesus. I wake up in him, I have no regrets. It's just been life, and it's been good. And it's been sober, and it's been happy. It hasn't been angry. It's been good. Not perfect. We still suffer. We still struggle. We still don't have all the answers for tomorrow's problems. But it's been good. The more I surrender to Jesus, the more fully alive I become. And the same is true for you. And it really gets down to one single question. Who do you say Jesus is? And the only person who can answer that question for you is you. When I answered that question, I said that you are the Messiah, Savior of my life. Even so, Lord Jesus, I come just as I am. And he waits for you.